I'm having a lot of trouble trying to make sense of the events that have happened in the past week. I'm not looking for answers, because answers would make the insanity real. If this was just down to me being crazy, then this would all make sense. God, I wish I was crazy. I love my dad so much. I idolized that man growing up. All kids had their favorite hero growing up. Mine was my dad. No matter what got him down in life, he still always managed to have a smile on his face for me. And that's why I can't get my head around it. Or maybe I don't want to make sense of it. My mother, who is also a lovely woman, a real sweetheart. You could say I'm a mommy's boy at heart. I noticed she started getting worried about my dad. I heard her talking on the phone with my grandmother about him coming home late with no real excuse for where he's been, and a strange odor coming from his clothes. I was getting a sense my poor mother thought he was cheating on her with someone. I knew for sure that couldn't be the case. Not my dad. For my mother's sake, I decided to confront him. I didn't want to flat out accuse him of being a complete asshole. I just wanted to know what he was up to after work. My mother was in the kitchen doing the dinner when I noticed the time on the clock. My dad should have been home an hour ago, and he's never late for dinner. My mother and I sat and ate our dinner without him. I didn't want to embarrass my mother by telling her I knew what was going on. I just sat and watched as she picked her food and stared at the clock. Long after I had cleaned up, my dad came nervously through the back door. He glanced me a nervous smile before disappearing down to the basement, which was really out of character for him. I wasn't letting this go. I was getting to the bottom of this, no matter what. I crept slowly down the basement steps and began to get the smell my mother was talking about. The smell was hard to describe, but it smelled like the crusty old sock behind my bed that my mother is afraid to pick up, and the musty odor that only comes from an old folks' home. When I got to the end of the steps, I could hear my dad sobbing uncontrollably, begging someone for forgiveness. I reached the end step, forgetting about the noise it made when you stood on it, alerting my dad to my presence. I didn't know what to expect. That glaring bright smile he only kept for me was now replaced with that hate-filled dead stare. He bore his teeth at me like a rabid dog growling before he made a run for me. He was too quick for me to react, and before I knew it, he had me by the throat, lifting me off the ground. He squeezed so hard I could feel the veins in my eyes bulge. I tried hitting him in the face to try and break free from him, but the more I struggled, the harder his grip got. I used the last of the air in my lungs, begging him to let me go. As he held me, he looked down at the phone in his other hand. I could swear I could hear someone laughing loudly on the other end, and without warning, my dad just dropped me. I lay on the ground holding my neck, too scared and confused to do anything. My dad just looked at me before slithering back into the dark corner of the basement, sobbing down the phone, begging someone for forgiveness. That night, I was in my room crying, trying to get my head around what just happened. I didn't want to tell my mother and upset her more. I'd never in my life seen my dad get violent in any way. That wasn't my dad down in that basement. I was scared for my mother, who had to share a bed with him that night. What if he tries to hurt my mother? So many thoughts were running through my head. As I sat there, I suddenly heard a knock on the door. I nervously ask who it is when my dad pops his head in the door. He has a big smile on his face and tells me goodnight as if nothing had happened. The next day, I planned to skip school and follow my dad to work. I sat in a coffee shop across from the building my dad worked in, waiting for him to finish. I sat there, and I was praying my dad was cheating. I was praying whatever the answer was, it was something that made sense. It was getting late, and it wouldn't be long until my dad left to go home like he was supposed to. As he left the office, he was on the phone with that same disturbed look he had on his face down in the basement. He looked at his watch as he went in the direction away from where we lived. I had no choice but to follow him, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what I could find. He was on the phone the whole time I followed him. Came to this old rundown house on the edge of town. I thought about my mother being distraught by the idea of my dad cheating on her as he walked up to the front door. I didn't see anyone answer the door before my dad seemingly let himself in. It was now or never. I decided there and then that I was going to confront him in the act. He wouldn't be able to talk himself out of it, and if he attacked me this time, I was ready for him. I walked up to the front and knocked as hard as I could. I kept on knocking, but no one would answer. The thoughts of my dad hiding inside the house angered me. I moved around the back to see if the back door was open. I glanced something out of the corner of my eye as I passed one of the windows. I crept up to the window to have a look. To my complete shock, it was my dad sitting on a chair looking horrified and sobbing uncontrollably. The room was large and empty, and it was just my dad in the chair. I tried banging on the window, but he just ignored me. I could see he was looking at something. Whatever it was, he seemed terrified by it. I couldn't understand why he didn't get up and run. He wasn't tied to the chair or bound in any way. The only thing different about him was his bare feet. As I screamed for him to move, I suddenly saw what my dad was looking at. It crawled across the floor towards my dad and moved unnaturally as it dragged itself slowly across the floor. Long hair covered its skeletal naked body. It kept moving towards my dad. He looked so scared as it edged itself closer to him. The closer it got, the more my dad cried. I tried breaking the window, but the rocks just bounced off it. It was inches from my dad. My dad seemed resigned to his fate as the creature stopped at his feet. The creature's bony fingers began searching the ground, sniffing around until it found what it was looking for. I don't think there are words to describe what happened next. The creature started licking my dad's feet. My dad wasn't scared or horrified anymore. He was laughing uncontrollably as the creature's long, slimy, snake-like tongue slithered all over my dad's feet. My dad was laughing so much he started sweating like he couldn't control it. The more the creature licked, the more my dad laughed. He began pissing himself as the laughing became too much. I thought my dad was going to laugh himself to death. As I stood there helpless, I noticed someone else was in the room. They seemed to be telling whatever it was on the floor what to do. They got in a frenzy the more my dad laughed. I couldn't get a good look at who it was. They looked small, like a child, but old and creepy at the same time. I couldn't hear what was going on, but something caught their attention, and a small girl walked into the room. The little person seemed scared of her and backed away into a corner. She walked over to my dad and began collecting his tears. I couldn't understand why my dad just sat there laughing his fucking head off while surrounded by crazy people. I was trying to come up with a plan to free my dad when I got a familiar smell. The same smell I got off my dad down in the basement. Before I could turn to see where the smell was coming from, something hit me in the head, and I woke up a few hours later still outside the house. It was getting bright and my head was pounding. Did I just experience some crazy acid trip, or was what I saw real? The house was empty, as if no one had ever stepped foot in it. All I could think about was my dad and if he was okay. When I got home, my dad wasn't there. My mom was in the kitchen distraught that my dad never came home. When I told her about following him to a house, it just made her worse. I didn't want to upset her more, so I left her at it. I went upstairs to lie down for a while. The blow to the head was making me tired, and I just needed to rest. I woke up, and it was dark out. I must have been asleep for hours. I was surprised my mother never called me. The kitchen light was on, and I could hear something moving about. As I made my way downstairs, I started to get that terrible smell again. At first, I thought it was my dad, so I ran to see if he was alright. The smell was pungent, but it wasn't coming from my dad. It was my mother, and she was huddled in the corner, sobbing uncontrollably down the phone, begging whoever was laughing on the other end of the phone for forgiveness.